John chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. After Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, a large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." I was in Mr. Arnold's grade 13 algebra class back in the ancient days when there was still grade 13 in Ontario. I had really no business being there. It had been at least 4 years since I understood anything that went on in math class. Alas, I had floated along like some students do from academic year to year, propelled by the combination of the charity of my math teachers, part marks, and the bell curve. Math was, and in many ways continues to be, a mystery to me. In contrast, my classmate and friend, Kirsten Ness, was a veritable math genius. She was one of those enviable people for whom math was a gift. Quadratic equations were like child's play to her. And for some inexplicable reason, Kirsten had a crush on my older brother. And for this reason, she didn't mind hanging around me. And so one lunch hour in the cafeteria, I looked over the algebra homework that was due that afternoon and my empty page, and I sighed, and I was just about to give up when I looked over at Kirsten Ness. "Kirsten," I said, "I'm having trouble with my algebra homework. I'm wondering if you could help me." I pushed my books over to Kirsten Ness. "Sometimes, if you ask, it shall be given." She went to work, and in 10 minutes, Kirsten Ness polished off my math homework. Later that afternoon in algebra class, I was hiding at the back when Mr. Arnold asked for volunteers to put the homework up on the board. The hands of all the math geniuses sprung up immediately, and then I remembered that a math genius had done my homework, and for the first time in the history of the world, my hand went up into the air. I was assigned a problem. I went to the board and copied it out. It might as well have been written in Chinese for all I understood, but I wrote the problem out and the answer, and I returned to my seat. And then Mr. Arnold took up the homework. When he came to my problem, he responded with a mixture of delight and surprise. "This is a particularly tricky problem," he said. And then Mr. Arnold turned to me and said, "I'm wondering, Mr. Congram, if you would explain how you solved this problem." I could have confessed, of course. I probably should have confessed. I probably should have said, "I didn't solve the problem, sir. Kirsten did." But instead, I went to the front of the class and talked about the mysteries of algebra as I understood them. Rob's new math with a confident evasiveness and every indication that I didn't have a clue about what I was talking about. Mr. Arnold, I am sure, could have seen through my charade. He perhaps, for the entertainment value of my explanation, decided not to call me out on it. It was the last time I would volunteer to put my homework on the board, and looking back now, maybe it was the beginning of a vocation, standing in front of people, talking somewhat confidently about the mysteries of the universe. I learned enough math that I can balance my checkbook, more or less, usually less, and figure out a tip at the restaurant, but not much more than that. Sometimes the Christian faith itself starts sounding like a strange new math. Philip Yancey wrote an essay entitled The Atrocious Mathematics of the Gospel. In his essay, Yancey showed just how peculiar Jesus' math really was. Jesus told the parable of a farmer who hired workers for his vineyard, some at sunrise, some at the morning coffee break, some at noon, some mid-afternoon, and some an hour before quitting. Everyone was happy to be hired, of course, until, that is, they got their paychecks. When the exhausted workers who had labored for 12 hours in the hot sun were paid the same as the sweatless ones who had just begun an hour ago. It sounded completely unfair. What kind of accounting was this? Even I can see that the numbers don't always add up. Then there was the poor widow Jesus pointed to in the temple. She dropped her only 2 coins in the collection bucket, and Jesus then said that counts far more than all the spare cash the wealthy ones were throwing in. What kind of math is this? In the 15th chapter of Luke, there are 2 stories about things that get lost. One is about a shepherd who leaves behind the flock of his 99 sheep to look out for the one that is lost. And then there is the somewhat manic woman who has lost a coin that is worth next to nothing, and yet she won't stop until she finds it. And when she does, she throws a party. What a foolish waste of time and energy, we might say. It's all terrible math, unless, that is, there is another context or point of reference in which it all makes sense. The story of the feeding of the 5,000 is one of the few told in all 4 Gospels. And in every version, the disciples are hung up by trying to do the math themselves. 5,000 men plus women and children, they're all hungry. The disciples don't have enough money to buy food for them. Providing for the crowd is impossible. They will have to leave and fend for themselves. The math is more than obvious in this case. And almost to emphasize or illustrate that the cupboards are empty, the disciples bring to Jesus a small child with his meager lunch in a basket. Jesus examines the crowd, peers down at the couple of tiny dried fish and 5 poor people rolls, and says, "Sure, that'll do just fine." The disciples say, "But, Rabbi, sir, there may be 5,000 people here, hungry people, hanging out here to hear you." Jesus, however, is completely untroubled by the unbalanced equation. Here is the new math. 2 fish plus 5 barley buns equals abundance. No surprise that the one who offers such a pathetic, measly meal of fish and bread to feed the crowd is a child. Those of us older than 7 would be too embarrassed, wouldn't we? Too self-conscious that people were watching. And what would they say? Or perhaps we'd be too selfish. Didn't we, in fact, earn what we've got and got it the hard way, thank you, deserve to keep it as well? Some of us are hoarding, holding on too tightly to what we have, who we are, because we're too self-focused. We can't bear to give anything away. Better to save it for a rainy day. And maybe, too, some of us are scared. We don't feel we have much in our baskets to offer. What measly talent I have, or so few skills, so little. What good is this little bit to anyone? Least of all to God. Self-focused or just embarrassed and scared, we end up hiding our light under a bushel basket. But this little guy, in that wonderful way children have of not knowing the impossible from the possible, sees that Jesus intends to feed the ravenous crowd with just 2 fish and 5 barley rolls. He stands there and he seems to say, I don't know how you're going to do it. I don't know how this all adds up. But what I have got, we all can share. Jesus blesses it and passes it to the disciples who act as the waiters and busboys. And when it's time to pick up the pieces, there are not 1, not 2, but 12 baskets of bread left over. Apparently, the 12 baskets are there for some purpose, overflowing their rims as the disciples stumble back to the front. And you have to laugh at these guys staring cross-eyed from the boy who'd had his 5 barley loaves to these stockpiles of bread up to their ears, and they're going, I have got to cut back on the tequila shots before noon. Here, then, for those of you who are keeping count, is the new math. 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish, equals abundance. Scott Black Johnston is the pastor of Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church in New York City. For many years, homeless people have been sleeping under the great arch of the entrance to the church, and the congregation has been stepping over them to get to meetings and worship. About 15 years ago, the congregation decided that they could no longer step over these people. The gospel required them to respond with compassion to the people literally on their doorstep. The result is that they have, at great expense, modified their building to create an overnight shelter where homeless people can find a safe bed and warm meal and some hospitality and a shower. Even so, there are some homeless people who do not trust institutions, and they won't come inside. They prefer to sleep out on the streets. And so the church said to them, you may sleep on our porch, and we will do our best to get to know you personally and protect you. And in the morning, if you want to come inside for breakfast, you are welcome. The neighbors of this church, however, are Trump Tower, Tiffany's, and Saks Fifth Avenue. And so one cold night, New York policemen arrived on the steps of the church. They knocked down the cardboard shelters and rousted out all the homeless people. It ended up in court. The city attorney said, you are running an illegal overnight shelter on the front porch of your church. You are chartered as a house of worship. This is not your mission. To which the church said, you'll have to ask Jesus about our mission. It went to court several times, and each time the courts have ruled in favor of the church. Then in 2008, the world collapsed economically, and the church found itself in a financial crisis. And Scott Johnston said, that his ministry suddenly became one of going to board meeting after board meeting with church officers to deal with the financial crisis, and every one of those meetings would end with somebody saying, "All right, I think we've got it under control for now, as long as another shoe doesn't drop." But then another shoe would drop. There would be another round of anxiety-ridden meetings which would end, "All right, I think we've retrenched now enough, as long as another shoe doesn't drop." Scott said he was doing pretty well with this, but one afternoon he became very frightened. He was all alone in the pastor's study, and he became very fearful that the church was headed towards failure, and he couldn't do anything to help it. And so he got down on his knees, and he prayed, "Lord, I'm afraid. Please, no more shoes dropping. No more shoes." Right at that moment, there was a knock on the study door. It was the sexton. "I think you better come down to the night shelter, Dr. Johnston," he said. He went down, and there were 2 New York City policemen standing there, and he thought, "Oh no, now what?" And one of the policemen said, "We've just raided an illegal factory in Brooklyn making counterfeit Timberland boots. We've seized the inventory, and we thought the homeless could use them. We have got 700 pairs of shoes here." Scott said he didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the abundance of God. Any of us who've attempted the practice of prayer for any length of time have discovered that, as Anne Lamott likes to imagine, no prayer stays in God's inbox forever. She says eventually it may come back, "Nope," or it might be, "You'll have to go step by step on this one." But sometimes, have you ever had those answers, maybe to one single prayer, or maybe a whole season of prayer, that come back, as in this story, like billows and billows of bread rolling in, more than you ever asked for, more than you ever imagined. Abundance, excess, surplus. 12 baskets of barley bread so full they're tumping sideways seem to say something about a God who is all about the impossible. Isn't that the outrage of the old story after all? It's the new math. It's impossible. It's over the top. It's what God is about.